This lecture today is going to cover the West after World War I. So we're going to focus on mostly the countries of Britain, France, the United States a little bit, pretty much anybody past Germany. So the important vocab to understand today is first and foremost going to be prohibition, which just means ban on manufacture or sale of alcohol. The Maginot Line, this is a series of fortifications. We'll go over it later, but it's built between France and Germany. Disarmament, which is the reduction of armed forces and weapons. The Great Depression, again, I just put this on here. We're going to be going on over this more in detail, but I put it on here for you to reference. And then finally, you should understand what overproduction is. So this is where there are more goods created than people can buy. So we're going to start with the Roaring Twenties, which occur right after World War I. And the Roaring Twenties, this video will demonstrate, is really characterized by jazz, and it's kind of like party time. So the Roaring Twenties are an economic boom that occurs in the 1920s after World War I, and it is mostly funded by American money. The United States had not been impacted that much during World War I because none of the wars actually fought on U.S. soil. So the United States began loaning money to everybody to rebuild, and quickly most of Europe rebuilt itself, and because of all the new products that came out during World War I and all the new technology, you see this huge economic explosion. It's driven by cheap, affordable consumer goods. Goods like washing machines, ovens, cars, cheap clothing, those are all really produced quickly. So people are able to buy a lot of those things, which creates lots of jobs and lots of money for corporations. New technology is really the key to this. Manufacturing is very, very easy now, so a lot of people can buy these goods. The 1920s is also a time of huge cultural change, and the biggest change is going to be that American culture becomes the dominant culture around the planet. There's going to be pushback to this, especially in countries like Germany and Japan, but American style of dress, American music, especially jazz, becomes very, very popular. Jazz is really an underappreciated thing now. It is the only real American music that we've really invented. It comes from a fusion of like Southern style blues with a little bit of bluegrass thrown in there, and it's just a really, unique American music. Women during this time also see a ton of progress during the 1920s. A lot of women in most Western countries had gotten the right to vote. The labor saving devices make it so women don't have to work inside the home as much. So women began to gain more education, more job opportunities, and that kind of led to the flappers, which are a lot of the younger women who worked in the factories during World War I, and they are considered rebellious, and they go out and they party, and they drink in the speakeasies, and they have jobs and work outside the home. So the 1920s come to be called the Jazz Age because that music kind of dominates the world during this time period. And jazz is unique because it also is really born out of the African American community, especially Louis Armstrong. So there's a lot of different musics that get mixed in together to make jazz. There's ragtime, there's bluegrass, there's blues, and it all kind of comes together, especially in St. Louis. And a lot of the original jazz bands were pretty much exclusively made up of Black members. You can see here kind of the differences between the generations. You have the older generation who would have been born before World War I, dressed very conservatively, kind of like the Victorian age. And then these were the stereotypical flappers of the 1920s. Not everybody goes for these social changes during the 1920s, and people do push back against it. In the United States, we see that in the 18th Amendment, which is prohibition. The idea that if we get rid of alcohol, it'll take care of all the social problems of the country. It'll take care of all the family problems. You're going to learn a lot about that in U.S. history, so I don't really hit it that hard here. The Christian fundamentalist movement also begins to gain steam, and this is a lot out in the rural areas of the United States and Britain, and they oppose a lot of the cultural changes. They want a more conservative society, how it was before World War I. Across Europe, there's also a bunch of changes internally. Britain has the main issue of the Irish question. Britain had conquered Ireland long, long ago, and right before World War I, they had passed the Home Rule Bill, which was supposed to allow Ireland to gain its independence. Because of World War One, sorry, it was postponed. During World War I, the Irish launched the Easter Rising to try and shake off British rule, which was put down rather brutally by the British. And it starts a long guerrilla war with the Irish Republican Army fighting the British for control of Ireland. In the United States, there's a Red Scare. As we just went over, the communists have taken over the new Soviet Union, and the United States is terrified that everybody is a communist, that they are infiltrating America, and they're going to turn the United States communist. You can see the Red Scare demonstrated here, like the communists are lurking around America and they're going to take over the United States and take all the liberties away. While there were communists in the United States, it was never to the extent that the Red Scare kind of made it out to be. See a little bit of the Irish independence movement here, the Easter Rising, what Ireland looks like now with the country of Ireland in green, and then this orange part of England still, or Great Britain. Internationally, the issue was how to kind of rebuild and deal with the fallout of World War I. France, Britain, and the United States are the main focuses of this, and France is terrified of another invasion from Germany. They know that Germany kind of wants revenge on them, so what the French do is they build a giant line of fortifications on their border with Germany that will become known as the Maginot Line, and these are huge fortresses, trenches, pre-built fortifications, so the Germans cannot invade France any longer. They also want the Germans to have to pay reparations to France in the form of money or resources so that Germany stays weak so it can't even build up enough of an army to invade France. Britain is kind of the opposite. They want everything to kind of go back to the way it was before World War I. They want to protect their overseas empire as well. So they don't want Germany to build up a navy, but they want Germany to rebuild their economy so that they can trade with them and make money. And this is kind of where France and Britain break from each other, because Britain wants to kind of roll back a little bit of the Treaty of Versailles. The United States decides to just totally exit world affairs, no longer deal with the European powers, and only focus on what is going on in the United States itself. This is a little bit of what the Maginot Line looked like. You can see that these fortresses, they're all underground, and they are hundreds of feet deep. They are just serious fortresses that no army is going to be able to get past. One of the things that nations try to do is they try and make it so a war is less likely to break out through diplomatic agreements. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact, while a good idea, it can't really be practiced that well. The idea was that all nations would give up war. They would no longer fight wars. They renounced it. And it was going to be enforced by the League of Nations. But as we know from the end of World War I, the United States didn't join the League of Nations, and we were going to be the muscle to kind of enforce it. But because we didn't join the League couldn't enforce the treaty, so it was just based on everybody's words. The London Naval Treaty was all the major nations of the world coming together to limit their building of warships and avoid another arms race. But all nations, and the critical one, is all nations pursue disarmament. They try to actually destroy some of the weapons they have so that it's less likely that another war breaks out. Because if your country doesn't have as many arms and weapons, they're less likely to use them. So after the 1920s and the Roaring Twenties era, the Great Depression hits. And this is going to be one of the huge turning points in history. It does lead to a lot of change because suddenly the world goes from this hopeful everything's getting better to the 20s to, the Great Depression. So the Great Depression is a global economic crash that occurs all throughout the 1930s. It ends in different times at different nations, but pretty much the 1930s are some of the worst times in modern history. It starts in the United States. We'll go over the reasons why, and it quickly spreads around the world to affect every country and every colony everywhere. And the major effect of it is going to be a lot of nations turn to dictators, to communism, because people feel that democracy has failed them because they can't even find enough to eat. So, one of the factors that led to the Great Depression was the Dawes Plan. And under the Dawes Plan, the United States was going to kind of act as the world's bank. And the US would lend money to Germany so that it could pay Britain and France back the reparations it owed them from World War I. And then France and Britain would then pay their loans back to the United States. So the key here is that the United States has enough money to lend out. So the United States lends out money to Germany, who then uses that money to pay back Britain and France, who then uses that money to pay back the United States. And at each cycle, the United States is making money because there's interest here. But if we take the United States out of this equation, you can see that the whole cycle falls apart. Now, suddenly, Germany doesn't have any money, so their economy collapses, which causes France and Britain not to have any money, so their economy collapses. They can't pay the United States back, which the United States sinks deeper and deeper into debt. Besides the Dawes Plan, these are some of the more general causes of the Great Depression. And first is overproduction. Factories were producing so many consumer goods during the 1920s, and it wasn't a problem because everybody had the money to buy them. But suddenly, they produced too many, and nobody could buy those consumer goods. So people had to be laid off at the factories because the factories couldn't sell their product. That kind of causes like a cascading effect where those people who get laid off, they can no longer buy products. So now there's even more overproduction, which leads to more workers being laid off. The New York Stock Exchange just kind of marks the beginning of the Great Depression. So the stock exchange in the United States, which again, you'll learn a ton about in U.S. history, crashes, and instantly companies lose billions of dollars, which makes them have to lay off workers, which again starts this whole cycle of overproduction. The U.S., as we went over with the Dawes Plan, had to stop lending money, which crashed the world economy. And because nations began to see that their companies were crashing, they put tariffs on international trade. So if there was a French company making baseball gloves and there was an American company making baseball gloves, the Americans want their company to succeed. So they put a tax on French baseball gloves, so you'll be more likely to buy the American baseball gloves. But then the French, they put a tax on the American baseball gloves if you're selling them in France, which makes it so neither country can sell what they need to kind of deal with the overproduction. So countries kind of overreact to trying to protect their home industries. So the overproduction cycle can kind of be shown like this. At first, companies, they overproduce. They produce too much stuff, which means that there's too much product. If there's too many products, that means that people can't buy them. So there's no buyers. With no buyers, the companies have to lay off workers because they're not making anything. So you get layoffs, which leads us back to overproduction because now those workers who are laid off can't buy anything. And you can just see the cycle gets worse and worse at each level. So reactions to the Great Depression vary based on the nation and the type of nation. I would say that pretty much all nations try public works. They build roads, bridges, electric lines, and their goal is just to provide jobs for people because if those people have a job, they can then go out and buy things to kickstart the economy. Social welfare is another one that pretty much all countries do. It's direct aid to people in the form of payments or food stamps that just directly help alleviate the suffering. Expansion is going to be done by some nations, and it's mostly going to be nations that fall under dictatorships. The idea of expansion is you build your army up. So not only do you get men working by putting them in the army, but then you go out and you take the resources that you need or want from other countries to fuel your country. And that's really going to be one of the big causes of World War II. So as we're going through World War II, I want you to think about why nations reacted differently to the Great Depression based on the position they were in and based on the government that they had. I hope this helps you make sense of the early 1920s and 30s. And if you need any help, just let me know.